Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sophia Silao, the Program Officer of the Special Projects Fund at New York Health Foundation. Welcome to the fourth of a six-part virtual learning series for grantees of the New York Health Foundation. Today's webinar is Practical Self-Care in the Workplace, Taking Care of Yourself so you can continue to help others. And we have quite a large group of individuals who signed up for today's session, and so we're really glad that you could join us.
All right.
Today's session is being recorded, and closed captioning has been enabled for those who need it. Now, if you've been following along these learning series, you know that for the first three sessions, we focused on various strategies to build resilient organizations. We discussed HR policies and practices, revisiting job descriptions, creative ways to offer professional development opportunities, all very important elements to nonprofit management. And I liken these to kind of focusing on the skeleton pieces of an organization. Today, we will focus on the heart of the organization, and which is your staff, and the importance of self-care in the workplace. We are pleased to have Megan Gorton today, a nonprofit capacity building advisor from NYCON, New York Council of Nonprofits, who will lead our session. Megan is a lifelong resident of Binghamton, New York in the Southern Tier. She has a background in special education and mental health, and most recently, prior to joining NYCON, she spent 16 years with Crime Victims Assistance Center, serving in different capacities, including serving as an advocate in the world of victim services and social work. Megan is especially passionate about trauma-informed practices and creating safer spaces in a variety of settings. She lives in Southern Tier with her husband and 6-year-old son, and we are so glad to have her here today. Megan, I will turn it over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophia. I appreciate that. And thank you all for joining me today. I very much appreciate when I have the opportunity to talk about self-care. You'll see I adapted the title a little bit because I feel like while I want to give us practical things that we can do, I also think it's important to make sure that self-care is meaningful. And so we want to make sure that we're doing things in the workplace that have meaning. And so what we're going to cover today are a few different things. So we're going to talk about having a healthy workplace. I want to make sure that when I refer to self-care, I want us to have sort of an understanding of what it actually means. And I think that sometimes when we talk about self-care, it's seen as an indulgence, right? It's seen as I have to, take care of myself. It's something that's special. But when I talk about self-care, I want us to think about it as a discipline because so many of us have a hard time doing it. We focus externally on our family, on work, and sometimes neglect our own self-care. Often we neglect our own self-care. So regular self-care, it's essential to having a healthy brain function, to being able to function normally at work, at home. And it's also important that while we're talking about healthy workspaces and stress and the brain, I love bringing in this element of science and helping us understand what's really going on with our bodies. And something that we don't necessarily talk about or understand is that we're talking about emotion. This whole topic is about emotion. And it's sometimes this sort of willy-nilly subject, but we need to understand that emotions control our brain and our brain controls our bodies, and all of it is all completely connected. So we are a creature of our emotions, whether we like it or not. And so we have to address it. We have to address those emotions when we're talking about self-care. So what is a healthy workplace? This is what we're striving towards, right? This is why we're taking care of ourselves. We're taking care of employees. We have to celebrate innovation and individuality. We encourage teamwork, collaboration in healthy workspaces and workplaces. Encouraging flexibility, autonomy, helping people reach their personal goals. More than anything else, when I see a healthy workplace, it really exemplifies and encourages self-care, and more than self-care, self-reflection, from leaders, from middle management, and sort of staff and everybody in between. It is hugely important that we understand that self-care is what drives healthy workplaces in many ways. And so when we see self-care happening and we see employee care happening, we are able to get these healthier workplaces, healthier workspaces. When you're honest about your mental state, when you're being clear, when you're communicating well with your staff, we're setting the tone. Leaders always set the tone for their staff. And as we're going through today, we're kind of looking at it in a couple of different parts. Really, the first part, we're talking about the brain, the functions of stress, and how we take care of ourselves, different ways that we take care of ourselves. Then also thinking about the culture that we create, and how we're sort of contributing to that culture, to a healthier workplace, and thinking a little bit larger about self-care and how it can affect us at work. And so, what does it look like? What are other things that we might see in these healthy workspaces? We're going to see flexibility, compassion, positive values, things that feel lighter. They don't feel as heavy in terms of maybe gossip or a feeling of ineffectiveness and burnout. We see that less in healthy workspaces where we're encouraging self-care. Oh, I think we have somebody. There we go. Okay. So where do we start when we're talking about self-care and creating these sort of healthier workplaces? We need to start with understanding stress and the brain and how stress works and what it does for us, how it helps us kind of function or not function. So stress and trauma are interconnected, and we're talking about the same sort of bodily systems that we might talk about when we're referring to trauma. It's a neurological and physiological shift that happens in our body when we have any kind of a threat. So oftentimes when we think of trauma, we think of something violent happening to someone. And of course, in my experience, like Sophia had mentioned, a lot of my experience comes from working with victims of crime, victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse. Those are the first things that I think pop in our heads when we think about stress, trauma specifically. But, those, when we think about trauma and all of the different things that could be traumatic, it doesn't necessarily have to reach that sort of critical level. Daily stressors, on top of things that are real and huge traumas, like racism, like poverty. Trauma can be layered, like stress can be layered. Feeling burnout at work, experiencing violence in the home, not knowing where your next meal is going to come from. All of these sort of traumas lay on top of each other. Stress does the same thing. It's really a shift that happens in your body. And when we feel stress, it's an adaptive response. It's not necessarily a bad thing that happens. Our body is getting ready for something. Our body, whether it's stress or trauma, is sort of preparing for fight or flight. So generally speaking, in our day-to-day interactions with other human beings, our prefrontal cortex is what's in control. It's our thinking brain, it's our logical brain. It's responsible for making us who we are. It's sort of intelligently relating our thoughts, our actions, our emotions, our extensive connections with other brain regions. It is in the driver's seat, prefrontal cortex. It really is responsible for all of these different things. And it's what's in control most of the time. So here's what changes. When we have a stress trigger, that could be an emotion. It could be your boss asking you to move up a deadline. It is immediate. A stress trigger happens, and there is an immediate change in the body. So once, and I want to throw this out there too, I am no scientist, but I'm incredibly interested in this. And I think that it's important for us to understand what's going on in our body. So once the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands are signaled, our sympathetic nervous system is activated. And interestingly, when you hear the word sympathetic nervous system, like what does that actually mean? It's a part of our body that sort of is in charge of our fight or flight response. It keeps us safe in a way. Our body becomes ready to respond to all kinds of different things. It's an alarm system. When this alarm system goes off, we become, maybe we can feel it in our heart, our pulse might change. Some people feel stress deeply in their stomachs, deeply and immediately. There is a body response. And in fact, the word sympathetic nervous system, the definition of sympathy is really just a state or a way of being that's similar to somewhere else. And so back in the 1800s, when doctors were sort of willy-nilly cutting people open, they were doing this. They were performing these autopsies on people, and they started taking a look at the lower part of the spine and all of these sort of bundles of nerves, and they realized that there were all of these interconnections, all of these different ways that our sympathetic nervous system was controlling our body. So it's all connected and immediately connected. And what becomes in charge is our midbrain and limbic system. It's our animal brain. It's our fight, flight, or freeze. It is a differing response. It tries to keep us safe. And so, chronic stress and trauma is something that occurs when that system is always on, knowing that that is not the way that it should be. So chronic stress, we're meant to feel, and it's supposed to move us forward. It's not supposed to linger in our body. When stress lingers in our body, when we stay in that state of trauma and that state of stress, things start to happen to us, to our clients, to the people that we're working with, people who are chronically stressed or chronically traumatized. This could also be us at work, okay? Looking to our left and to our right at our colleagues who may be experiencing chronic stress at work, home, trauma. So sometimes that means bodies are on high alert. We can't necessarily read or accurately understand our cues, our body cues. Our memory is affected. Our problem solving is affected. We can't necessarily sense our own internal state. When these things happen, we also have clients or colleagues who are missing meetings. Our sense of time might be distorted. And that cortisol lingers in our body, and cortisol is associated with all kinds of negative health implications, depression, anxiety, and more physical body functions, problems with the gut and the stomach a lot of times as well. So all of these things are happening from this system that is when we get kind of stuck in this stress system and our limbic system is always in control. That's not the norm. That can't be the norm. And our body is affected because of it. So we start to hear about, all of these kind of terms like secondary trauma, like burnout, like compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma. And, I think it's important that we understand what these words kind of mean and what we're talking about and how they're connected to each other. They seem to sometimes be thrown around in conversations interchangeably, but they're not interchangeable, but they are connected. And so when we think about secondary trauma, that is simply being exposed to somebody else's firsthand trauma. So hearing about it, seeing it, either of those things, we experience that secondary trauma. So for people who are working with vulnerable populations, I would say this is something that you are probably dealing with or you've heard about. Burnout is another word that's kind of thrown around that we're going to talk about today. Burnout's a term that's been used since the late 70s, although it's definitely gained popularity in the last decade or so. It's used to describe a hitting of a wall almost. It's basically, you know, when we have low job satisfaction, we're feeling powerless at work, we feel overwhelmed, we are doing too much and also having the feeling that we're not doing any of it well enough. Burnout is a wall that you hit, and can't necessarily be fixed by self-care. So it's something we want to be aware of and understand. So when you have secondary trauma and you have burnout at work and you kind of combine these two things, what ends up happening sometimes is compassion fatigue. And compassion fatigue is sort of described as sort of the cost of caring for others, their emotional pain. And what happens is a shift in worldview. You know, feeling like there's nothing that I can do, there's nothing that I can do can help. It's too much. Nothing works kind of feeling. And sometimes this is coming from inefficient systems, frustration, system frustration, poor management sometimes, high workload, high client load. There are lots of different contributing factors. And sometimes this compassion fatigue is referred to as vicarious trauma. Sometimes vicarious trauma is the tricky one, is referred to as sort of this whole process of secondary trauma and burnout, compassion fatigue. None of this is super important, but it's important that we understand that they're different things. You know, we don't have to remember these definitions. In other words, we just have to understand that they're separate and there's a relationship between them. What we're going to focus on today is burnout. So burnout, again, it's this wall we want to avoid. It's sometimes too large to heal without taking a significant step back. The stages of burnout, you know, we're generally getting into nonprofit work because, you know, we're passionate about the work that we're doing. We're passionate about the cause. It's oftentimes a little bit more flexible. It's oftentimes, you know, a nicer environment to work in. So there's a lot of benefits of working, you know, for a nonprofit and for humans in general. But, you know, there are things that come with it. And, you know, there is this sort of process of burnout going from this honeymoon phase, adding on stress and job dissatisfaction. And it just sort of progresses when we're not taking care of ourselves and when we're not taking care of employees and staff. It's not just self-care. It's all of those things. So we need to understand that when we get to that number 5, this chronic burnout, it's hard to take a step back from. If you feel yourself approaching burnout, this is our cue that we need to do some self-reflection, take care of ourselves, think about our environment and our own kind of state of mental health. And remembering this too, that there are different roles. You know, it is our role as an employee to practice self-care. But if you're a manager, if you have the opportunity to be a leader, to be in charge of others, the way to promote self-care is to promote healthy workplace culture. You know, it's the same kind of thing. So when we're practicing self-care, when we are modeling self-care, we are promoting that healthy workplace culture. So what leads to burnout? You all know what leads to burnout. I think that, you know, we're all familiar with the feeling of leading up to burnout. And many of us, when we approach that, again, that wall, we can start to feel it. We know we're stressed at work. We know that when we wake up in the morning, we have this need or this feeling of, you know, doom and dread if we're burnt out, that we just can't face, you know, another day of it. But, you know, we know what it feels like. But what's leading to it is all of these things, unrealistic deadlines, having a high workload, not knowing what to do about the high workload, or maybe not being supported around it. Role clarity, not knowing what's expected of you is uniquely stressful. If expectations are moving targets, meaning the expectation from day to day is changing, that is a way to create stress for your staff. So thinking about, you know, how clear is my role? How clear is your role? Not having any control over your work. So, you know, and for some people, right? For some people, this leads to burnout. For some people, this is a way of avoiding burnout, just kind of going to work and doing the things, right? So some of this is based on personality, on our own resilience, which we're going to talk about a little bit too. Or unfair treatment, favoritism, unfair compensation, that kind of thing. So some of it can be systems, unfair, biased systems can absolutely lead to burnout. So effects of prolonged stress on the body, all of us, we are highly, highly affected by prolonged stress. And that cortisol that I was talking about is really the culprit in this. I also want to mention too, I forgot to mention this, that in the chat, there is already a couple of handouts that I am going to be referencing at some point. So medically, just living physically in our bodies, stress changes our body. It affects all of our bodies. So remember when I kind of talked about the sympathetic nervous system? These are the things that this sympathetic nervous system that we're talking about today controls. In other words, unchecked emotions and stress show up in your body. That's another way of saying that. So it's easy to say, like, these are the effects of stress. But another way of saying that is if you don't pay attention to stress, if you ignore stress, if you ignore your emotions, your body will let you know that you're ignoring those things. And so what do? How do we take care of ourselves? Self-care is the next thing we want to talk about. So there are 7 pillars of self-care, all of these different sort of ways that we can start to address our needs. And so this is going to look different for everybody. Not everybody, for example, will be drawn to a physical self-care. So physical self-care being, being active and eating well, going to the doctor, all of these things. We may be more drawn to social, during social self-care. And here's what some of this looks like. So intellectual self-care is book learning, thinking. Intellectual self-care is, I don't want to say distracting, but it's feeding our minds. Engaging in critical thinking is how some people provide care for themselves. Social self-care, like I mentioned before, is enriching relationships. So hanging out with friends, doing things, being silly, nurturing relationships that are sort of outside of your family. Relational, being in your family, strengthening those relationships with your kids, with your parents, with your spouse, whatever that might be. You want to make sure that you have that support system. That's, building your security and your support system. Also safety and security. So making sure that your environmental and financial safety and security is taken care of. So this includes affordable healthcare, access to mental health services. Mental health support is huge. So we want to make sure that we know the different ways for ourselves that work, the things that work for us. Emotional self-care, it could be positive self-talk, bubble baths, how do we care for our emotions? This could also be going to talk to a counselor once a week, having, a set day to talk to your mom every week or your best friend. Who cares for you? So thinking through some of that. Physical self-care, again, this is for everybody, but adopting an exercise routine, prioritizing sleep is for everybody. And picking nourishing foods over highly processed ones is always great. And spiritually, this looks vastly different for different people. When I say spiritual self-care, I don't mean religion necessarily, although if that's what you're drawn to, absolutely. Your church services on the weekend, nature, it could be meditating, acts of kindness, a gratitude journal, all of those things, taking care or thinking about something that's higher than yourself is really what that means. We have to put good things in the piggy bank. We can't take things out of the piggy bank unless we're putting things in. So, limbic resiliency is a word that I really like too. Finding these self-care activities that reduce cortisol and, take away some of these stress hormones in your body. The benefits being, helping your health, taking care of your physiological health. Your self-care is absolutely vital. And so is resilience. And we all have different levels of resiliency, depending on what we bring to the table. So the last time we spoke about layered trauma and layered stress. And depending on how many layers of those we have, you know, we know that there is stress that sits in our body, but this is the way that we can start to combat things. So learning how we respond to different situations and how different things affect us is really a great starting point for growing our resilience and our understanding of, okay, so for me, when I'm at work and I'm addressed in a certain way or spoken to in a certain way, those are the things that stress me out. So what can I do? What are some things that I can do if I'm recognizing, if I have that awareness? How can I start to recognize that? So after a stressful event, we have to think through, okay, what were the actual physical things that were happening to me, that was happening to me during that stressful event, during and after. So the way we think, the way we feel, and what we do to sort of come back from it. Having an awareness of ourselves is huge. So what stresses me out and what brings me back? And this isn't something that we can just sometimes, reach for and grab. We do have to kind of take a minute and sit in it and think about it. And being well. So, our resiliency comes from how well we take care of ourselves, our physical well-being, our connections. So people always talk about resiliency. What is it? We all have different levels of resiliency, different levels of wellness. We don't want to put too much pressure on ourselves, but at the same time, this is how we build that resiliency, having those connections to sort of fall back on, being able to talk through your emotions, being able to recognize, I need to do better at X, Y, and Z. That will make me more well. And how we cope, challenging our stressors. So again, having that awareness, if we're able to sit and think about, okay, what are those stress triggers for me? Stress is about perception. So it's easy to say, like, I am stressed because you did this thing, but understand that it's your body and your brain's perception of that thing that matters. So what stresses out, obviously, what stresses out person A is going to be different than what stresses out person B. So we really have to think about, how is this unique to me? And we have to think about our thoughts. Thoughts, when we have a stressful event, sometimes we have these negative thoughts and they just devolve and get worse and worse and worse and worse. And we let ourselves go down this like negativity slide. So how do we get ourselves out of that? How do we manage those negative thoughts? And how do I get support? Who can I just call up and say, like, I am so stressed out. I can't stop thinking about this one thing. Either distract me or help me through it, one way or the other. So getting that support is hugely important. It's the feeling of being able to get up once we've been knocked down. How well do we do that? How well do we bounce back? And overcoming burnout. This is a cute little cartoon that I think gives a nice, well-rounded view of some things that you can do to start addressing your own burnout. And so again, burnout is a wall. There are the things that I can do, yes, but they might involve taking a deeper look, like different job options, writing down your stressors, all of these different, but some of these things that we talked about, using some sick leave, taking a mental health day, or maybe a leave of absence, whatever that might look like for you. We have to kind of follow the things that help us beat us, whatever that might look like. And what counts as self-care? It's something that brings you sustained joy in the long run. That's the self-care. It's not, I see so many people, or have spoken to so many people who will say like, oh, I'm a mom of four and I got a shower this morning by myself. That's self-care. Maybe if you're, maybe, but what we, like I said before in the beginning of our chat, self-care is discipline, not indulgence. Regularly, routinely taking care of yourself. And, choose a thing that works for you. Again, not all the same things work for everyone. There are things that are scientifically backed activities. There are activities that you can do that are shown to reduce cortisol in the body. And so these are some of these things. So exercise and yoga specifically, the combination of breath and mindfulness in yoga is scientifically shown to reduce levels of cortisol in the body. Same with meditation and mindfulness, which are connected. Cognitive behavior therapy is a way of, it's a type of therapy where you address your own behaviors, whether those are responses to stimuli. Many people have found, many trauma survivors have found cognitive behavioral therapy to work for them. People with who have some sort of long-term trauma, CBT has been helpful for. Mindfulness is the thing we hear about a lot as well. Mindfulness, being mindful, connecting to the things that you're doing. And this is really just this idea and this understanding that, as human beings, we're distracted all the time by all different kinds of things, whether it's phones, technologies, kids, work. Mindfulness is taking time to just be present and be in the moment. So if I'm doing dishes, I'm really focused on the dishes. I'm washing each dish, kind of like using that as a grounding activity, calming myself. Chores and repetition are another way, which is a little counterintuitive, but very similar to mindfulness in that, we're doing this sort of repetitive behavior over and over again. Starts to change the patterns in our brain. Massage scientifically has shown, so this is a good thing to remind your spouse, massage is scientifically proven as a stress reducer. That's true, reducing cortisol levels in the body. So is nature, sitting in nature, especially meditating in nature, combining some of these things. And travel and vacation is another thing that's been scientifically backed. So, if one of these things isn't your cup of tea, again, as long as that thing is bringing you sustained joy in the long run, making you feel whole and like yourself again, that's how we're picking these activities. So I want to just reference, if you guys could pop in the chat and just take a peek at self-care at work. This is just self-care at your desk. This is just a nice way to kind of do some things. If you want to post this, print this out, post it by your desk. Again, there are all of these different things that we can do personally, things that help us at our desk in the moment. Doing a 60-second desk cleanup, keeping healthy snacks in the office, being comfortable, 5-minute stretches, practicing good eye screen health. So just taking a break from those.
Megan, I will say, we're still on your slide.
Oh, no.
You have that pulled up.
Let's see. You share. Oh, sorry about that. Thank you, Sue. So this, so again, this is in the chat for you all to reference. Just some things that you can do at your desk to practice self-care. Some people keep like a little list of words, inspirational things. If you have a quote that makes you happy, that keeps you focused, put the quote up on the wall. There are, staying hydrated is huge. Boundaries. So productivity boundaries, for me, this is a thing that I like to do. Right now I'm working from home, so it's not, quite as much as an issue. But, just saying, hey, I'm working on X, Y, and Z right now. I just need about 10 minutes, and then I can take a break. So kind of setting those boundaries at work, just like you do at home and in other places, it is really good for productivity and for your own kind of self-care. Setting time aside, like if it helps you within your schedule, scheduling time to respond, scheduling time to take a break, scheduling time to drink water. Those are things, if they help you stay, in that sort of mindset of self-care, it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be time consuming. It just has to be intentional. And it has to be, like I said, it's a discipline and not a indulgence. So I'm going to go back to, okay. So, again, just a reminder that self-care isn't everything. So as a manager, as a leader, we have to think about organizations.
And we are on your notes view.
Oh,
No.
okay. Hang on 1 minute here.
Okay.
I'm just going to redo my slideshow because you never know when technology is going to do things that you don't expect. So, slide. Okay. Okay. So, understanding that self-care isn't everything, like I said before. So when we're in unhealthy situations, or we're in a situation where you're seeing these, inefficient systems internally in your own organization, maybe, or you're burnt out, really burnt out. And remember, I said, that's the wall. The message to the people that we work with and the message to the people who work for us can't always be take care of yourself, take care of yourself. At a certain point, it puts the burden of working in unjust contexts, like this Vicki Reynolds says. I don't know who Vicki Reynolds is, but I love this quote so much. It puts this unjustness on our backs. And somehow, if we don't take care of ourselves enough, then it's our fault. So I just want to sort of normalize that, even though we are talking about self-care, like I said, it's a discipline, it's important, but it isn't everything. Again, with, the reminder for ourselves that, our role as an employee is to practice self-care, and role as a manager is to promote a more healthy kind of culture. And even if it's not manager, we all have sort of circles that we can affect. So it's something to think about. And so as we're sort of thinking about healthy environments and understanding that addressing our culture, or even starting to address our culture, thinking about culture, is beginning to combat burnout. So I want to, in the chat, if you all could think about, what are some examples of work culture that impact staff negatively? What are things that you see or have seen in the course of your career, culturally, internally, that affect staff in a poor way? If you guys could start to just put a couple things in the chat, I would appreciate that. If anybody has any thoughts about that. Instability in leadership, lack of respect for boundaries. Absolutely. Yep. We see some of those things happening, right? We see staff changes right now. There is a huge, huge issue right now with staff turnover, which means that we're going to have different leadership. And, when the person who's in charge, the leader, builds the culture. So I can completely understand how that would be difficult to start to build culture. Lack of respect for boundaries, absolutely. Gossip, I think. Okay, passive aggressive management, sure. Clarity, right, is hugely, hugely important. Providing clear communication, providing that clarity to your staff. So communication issues, right? Having multiple offices, inconsistencies. Oftentimes when you have those multiple offices, the inconsistencies are also cultural, right? So, having a staff over here and a staff over here, this staff functions one way and this other staff functions in a different way. So absolutely, there are so many different things that happen across the board in companies and nonprofits that aren't healthy, that don't feel good. And so we need to sort of cultivate self-care with culture. and think about how we're contributing to that. So if we are in a position to contribute to positive culture, we have to find out what's going on. So data is key. Asking the right questions, frequent and focused surveys, in whatever you want to ask. This is definitely something that you could do, doing a little kind of climate survey internally. How do we feel about this? What about this? Ask those important questions. The key is being ready to hear the answer. And once you get that feedback, what do I plan on doing with this feedback? Because there's no point in asking for that data, asking for those, the information via survey, if we're not prepared to act upon it, and start to change some things if we're in a position to do so. Focusing on people instead of, management, managing things, guiding and coaching people, creating opportunities for connection, connecting individually. If individual supervision, isn't a thing, creating that. And then within those one-on-one meetings, I've talked to directors who are doing these sort of really important assessment questions, like employee health questions, really at every opportunity. 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, for new employees, whatever that's going to look like for you. Create those opportunities for connection. People may say, oh, it's too much, but we crave it. We crave connection, and we need it to really have good teams. Role modeling kindness and respect. Helping people manage their workload, kind of. And I understand sometimes there's nothing that we can do about this, or not a lot that we can do about this. But we can kind of creatively support our staff. We can ask questions. We can start to think through things with them. Really just help people feel like you're on their team. That's how you guide someone and coach someone. We are on the same team. We have the same mission. Let's do this together. And creating space for highly engaged communication. So with clarity, basic training, on communication for staff, role modeling it, role modeling open and honest communication, and ensuring some psychological safety, which we're going to talk about in a minute, to promote free, respectful communication. So how am I intentionally creating these spaces within my organization or just my team so that they feel safe to communicate with me? How am I responding to them when they do communicate with me? Is it positive? Is it negative? Is there always a barrier to communicating with me? Thinking through some of those things. And again, thinking through workplace culture. I can't say enough about role modeling vulnerability, or, showing your staff how you want the culture to go. So, when you're feeling overloaded at work, or you're feeling like it's too much, how do you communicate that to your staff? Or do you not? Do you always sort of put your head down and pretend things are okay? Because if you do, know that that's the culture you're building. And that's really it. What opportunities are we creating to model a healthy workplace? Encouraging or using my own vacation time, modeling that. How are we caring for our staff? Always an important thing to think through. And psychological safety. So, differing from psychological safety is psychological danger, which I want to talk about first, actually. So psychological danger could feel like sitting in a meeting. Maybe you are a brand new staff member, maybe not. But maybe you're a brand new staff member, a slightly new staff member. You are expected to contribute to a conversation, maybe about an event, but or a program or a process, whatever it might be. There is a fear of admitting mistakes because you see how mistakes are handled internally. So maybe there's negative things being said at the meeting, like, "Oh, we've tried that before. That doesn't work. That's blah blah. This person's fault." There's all these sort of negative things happening at a meeting. those negative things are preventing you from speaking and speaking your mind freely because you are worried about the repercussions of sharing, even if it's a small repercussion, like, being shut down, essentially. What ends up happening is it's less likely to share these differing views or difficult views. Or maybe I have this like amazing idea that nobody else has said before, but I'm just not going to share this idea because it does not feel safe to share it at this point, because I feel like it's probably going to get shot down and I'm going to be told that my idea is useless. So, this idea of psychological danger sometimes really does keep back a staff from fully succeeding, and creates this sort of common knowledge effect. So you're not getting any kind of new, amazing creative ideas. What we want is psychological safety, feeling comfort so you can see and you can witness in this group maybe a mistake being made or talked about, or having a failure that we learn from. Ideas are openly shared and valued, and we see some good innovation. We see decision making happening in real time. So, we want to create that safety. And so how do we do that? We have to show our team that we're engaged. So again, I can't be sitting at a staff meeting, flipping through my phone or, fiddling with something and not paying attention. We have to show the engagement to let our team also be engaged. If there are inherent issues in what you're discussing, let your team see those inherent issues. Let them see your understanding of it. Don't blame to build trust. So don't throw Susie under the bus to build trust with Tommy. We have to hold ourselves accountable, hold other people accountable, of course, but don't blame to build trust. Being self-aware. Again, that self-awareness is one of the best ways to move towards coping and creating a staff who are able to cope when negative things happen. And thinking through maybe the negative voices in your organizations, and thinking through ways to kind of combat that negativity, because it very much it catches that negativity spreads. Include your team in decision making, be open to feedback. And when people fail, there is learning that comes from that. So how do we handle that? How do people feel when there is failure? How do we hold people? How do we help them through to make that, or to help them achieve future goals? Mentoring is something that is helping some organizations. So setting up sort of a relationship between two people, a newer staff member and a more seasoned staff member, really just focusing on career development, providing support and reflection. This is something that's helping some organizations build up that sort of positive culture, that more of a self-care culture. And this is something that we can also do. So thinking through the data, asking people questions, or thinking through, so not just asking people questions, but thinking through processes. So how are we structured? What are the things that we do? Are employees encouraged to use benefits? How do we address failure? All of these different things are ways that we can assess our culture. Thinking through that, not good, not bad necessarily, but just where are we right now and where do we want to be and how do we get there? So thinking strategically, the same way we do about board development, the same way that we do about strategic planning, but thinking about culture. And so, breaking it down a little bit, we have to learn what motivates our workforce, practicing listening, really listening to our staff, not just, lip service, sitting and understanding our staff individually. I think some people are very kind of hands-off, like, oh no, like I'm not a friend boss, I'm a boss. We don't have to be friends with our employees, but understanding their motivations, the things that they deal with, what their family makeup is like, that's how people feel cared for. So, there's learn what motivates them, help people increase the emotional intelligence of their organization. So, um, empathetic responses, trust, motivation, psychological safety is another way of talking about that in a kind of a wider context. Rewarding hard work in any way that you can. So, it's not always an option for us to say, okay, well, I'm going to give you a raise. That's not always something that we can readily do. But, how can we as an organization build things into our practices so that we are rewarding hard work? Maybe it's flexibility. Maybe it's a day of remote work. Maybe this is just a really super creative way that you do this. But think through it. And adopting a culture of psychological safety, like we talked about. These last couple of things I just want to mention, thinking about breathing spaces and providing your employees with these simple resources to let them know that you're encouraging them to do these things. This is something that was shared by the TEND Institute that deals specifically with trauma-informed care. But the 3-minute breathing space, it's not meditation, it's just breathing. Things like this, sharing this with your staff, finding small tools and resources that I can communicate with my staff, these things that might help, encouraging self-care that way. There's also a tool that can be used called the ProQual. So this is the second handout. I'm going to attempt to kind of walk us through this. Give me one moment. So ProQual is a way to sort of score compassion fatigue and, compassion satisfaction and fatigue. It's a way to measure burnout to a certain degree. People have to be honest. And, this is really a tool that people can use more personally, I would say, for us to kind of think about our level of stress. So questions about your mental state of mind, essentially. What are the thoughts that I'm having? And so scoring it, and I am going to have a better understanding of my compassion satisfaction, so sort of the opposite of compassion fatigue, my level of burnout, and my level of secondary traumatic stress. So this is important if you are in a profession where you're working, again, with more vulnerable populations. That can be really important. So making sure that, oops, didn't want to do that, but that's okay. Making sure that we're doing those things. And I just want to thank you all. I want to leave it open for questions. We have a few minutes. There's my contact information. Just there we go. Does anybody have any questions? Lingering thoughts? No. Well, thank you all for your attentiveness, for listening. I appreciate it. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Right.